Hi, I'm Roger and welcome back to the Tractor Tech channel. Really excited for this build I have going on today. It is a Farmertec MS880. Normally I couldn't justify a saw like this because a saw like this from the steel dealer would be $2,000, but you can purchase a saw like this from Farmertec for around $500. So go ahead and get some parts out and get started on this build. So obviously on a build like this you need to start out and assemble the crankcases by putting the crankshaft in there. When I pulled the crankcases out, I noticed I only had one dowel pin. Apparently in the process one of the other dowel pin had fallen out. So when you're building these saws, there are two dowel pins. They are very critical because they do hold the crankcase in alignment. So without them you'd be headed for problems. So now that I have my parts laid out, my crankshaft has been in the freezer for over a day, so getting it ready for assembly. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and clean the crankcase and the oil tank out to get it ready for assembly. As you can see, there's some machinings in there. Now I saw where Dyno Joe did a video where he actually machined on an old, or ground on an old crankcase down into a crankcase, and then started the saw and ran it and tore it back down, and it really didn't hurt anything. But it never hurts to have things clean. So I'm going to get things cleaned up and ready for assembly. Going to start by heating the crankcase to approximately 130 degrees. Or actually just the bearing, the inner race. Now that the crank bearing has been heated and the crankshaft has been in the freezer, it should slide together pretty easily. Right there it went. Again, be sure both of your dowels are on the case half. You can repeat the same process for this case half. Okay, now we're ready for some bolts. These may be the bolts we need. I didn't show putting the first two bolts in the crankcase because I needed just a slight bit of assistance getting it down on the dowel pins. So go ahead and drop the rest of the bolts in. I'll go ahead and get those torqued down. Recently in one of my other videos, somebody commented that I was under torquing the case half bolts with this screwdriver. This screwdriver is a snap-on screwdriver, and if you look at it, it's kind of sort of like triangular shaped. This is their more expensive screwdriver called the Instinct screwdriver. Then just for comparison, this is a cheaper screwdriver they sell, but you can still see the handle size. That one has a Phillips bit. And this is a Craftsman. It's a T25. I don't have a T27 Craftsman. You can see the difference in the diameter of the handle. Even on a Craftsman with the larger diameter handle, you're not going to get the torque that you can out of this screwdriver. You can get far more torque out of this screwdriver than you can this one. Those bolts don't torque very much, so I can easily over torque the bolts with this screwdriver if I wanted to. Started out with this bolt here, then I came to this one. I don't know, probably wouldn't be bad to get one up here now. Kind of want to draw the case down evenly. So now the crankcase gasket needs trimmed. Alright, so my crankshaft is centered. Now I'm ready to go ahead and put the piston onto the connecting rod. When you trim the crankcase gasket, be sure that it is flush, because if it sticks up, your cylinder gasket isn't going to set flat. It's going to cause an air leak. Before I put the piston on, I'm going to put a little bit of oil down on the rod bearing. Here is the piston bearing, wrist pin bearing, piston pin bearing, whatever you want to call it. Go ahead and put that in the rod. One of the circlips can go ahead and be installed in the piston. I'm going to put the one on the clutch side because if you look at the crankcase, it sticks up a little bit. There's not going to be as much access. It's open on the flywheel side where it will be easier to do on the last one. Go ahead and get this circlip in. They make a specialized tool to do this job that would probably make it much easier. Right now the piston is ready to go onto the rod. The arrow goes towards the muffler. And now the last circlip can go on. When I install the circlips, I always like to install them like this in this picture. This is from a Wiseco piston. So now the rings can go on the piston. These are caber rings that came with this saw. You can see the longer portion of the ring that goes to the bottom. There's a locating pin on the piston that goes underneath. So go ahead and slide the ring down on very carefully. One, repeat the same process for the top ring. A locating pin is over on this side. I'm going to go ahead and put just a little oil on the piston. And then a little oil up in the cylinder also. Just look how massive that cylinder is. You also need to check your cylinder and make sure there aren't any rough edges around the ports. This one is good to go. The casting and the plating keeps looking better and better on these cylinders all the time. We're ready for the gasket to go down on the crankcase. I'm using this Husqvarna piston ring compressor tool. Cylinder can now go down on the piston. Remove the ring compressor. Now slide it down one more. So it takes these really long bolts for the cylinder. I already have one started in. I did have to switch over to the T-handle to have something long enough to run these down in. Now I can install the flywheel key. Now with the key installed, the flywheel can go on. Flywheel nut can go on the crankshaft. Next thing I'm going to do is put the muffler on. I'm going to leave the heat tape off just for now until I get a little runtime on the saw, and then I'll install it. That way if there's an issue where the thing would need torn back down, I won't have the heat tape to deal with or have to buy more. These bolts are for the muffler. They go in the crankcase. So with the studs on, the muffler can go in. We use 2 bolts like we used on the case halves. I have the gasket on the back. Muffler on. I don't like that there's a gap there, so I'm not going to put the cover on. I don't see any spacers. I'm going to have to look at some other IPLs and see if there is a spacer for in there. If not, I'll have to make something. So next thing is I have my spark plug gapped. Go ahead and put that in, and the compression release. I'm going to stop there for part 1 of the MS880 assembly. Starting to look a little bit like a chainsaw now. Stay tuned for part 2.